Hey everyone, how's it going? And welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Liz from the Dfinity Foundation. Community Conversations is an opportunity for you, the community, to hear from contributors in the internet computer ecosystem, as well as ask them questions live. So today we have NYU Courant School of Mathematics Professor of Computer Science and Principal Researcher Victor Shoup, who will discuss the upcoming vote around threshold ECDSA signatures. In this talk, he will outline the cryptographic techniques used to reach the objectives of the proposal, which centers around Canister's ability to be able to hold BTC and ETH and for them to be able to create Bitcoin and Ethereum transactions. So since those networks use ECDSA, a canister must be able to create ECDSA signatures. We have an upcoming vote on this topic, as I mentioned before. It will go live on Monday, September 20th at 3 p.m. UTC, and it will end 48 hours later on Wednesday, September 22nd at 3 p.m. UTC. And you can go ahead and vote at the NNS DApp. That's nns.ic0.app starting Monday, September 22nd. So, not to steal any more of Victor's thunder, please give him a warm welcome and feel free to take it away, Victor.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm hoping I have about 30 minutes of a presentation, and then the rest we can use for Q&A. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that timing is perfect.
Okay, so as Liz already kind of briefly outlined, I'll go through that again. So what are our objectives? So we want canisters to be able to hold Bitcoin and Ethereum and to create Bitcoin and Ethereum transactions. Okay, so to do this, we want canisters to be able to create ECDSA signatures. And to do this securely, right, we need, what we're going to really want to do is use a secure distributed signing protocol. So this means that I won't go into all of the math about it. These are pretty well-established techniques. We have a secret signing key, and there's not going to be any one single point of failure. So it's actually, the signing key is going to be broken up into shares. So this is called secret sharing. It's a pretty well-established technique. And these shares are distributed among all the replicas in a subnet. So the replicas in a subnet will have to agree to create a specific ECDSA signature as requested by a canister. And, you know, a canister will be in charge of enforcing any kind of arbitrary access control policy that will determine when and under what conditions a signature would be created. Once, right, the canister gives the go-ahead to create a signature, then the replicas, which hold these secret shares, will then collaborate with one another to generate, actually the protocol is pretty simple. They'll just generate shares of the signature, and then these shares of the signature are then combined to form the signature itself. So those are the high-level objectives. Now, some of you might be familiar with our Chainkey technology, and we already do some distributed signing protocols in the internet computer. So I want to briefly touch on the relation between this new type of ECDSA signing protocol and the ones that we currently already use. So currently, the internet computer uses so-called BLS signatures, but which have a lot of nice properties, but they're unfortunately just not compatible with Bitcoin and Ethereum. So we just kind of have to use ECDSA if we want to be compatible with Bitcoin and Ethereum. So that's not really a question. Unfortunately, compared to BLS, ECDSA, the signing algorithms are significantly a bit more complicated. So this makes it harder to design efficient distributed signing protocols. It's a bit more challenging. Also, the security of ECDSA itself, I could go on and talk for an hour about kind of the history and of ECDSA, you know, why it is the way it is, and it's a bit of a frustration. Certainly, you know, ECDSA has been analyzed, but and there is significant amount of theoretical evidence that it's secure, but the security proofs are not quite as satisfying, let's put it that way, as for things like BLS. So the security is, let's say, just a little bit less well understood than BLS, but nobody knows how to break it, and we have pretty good tools for analyzing it. But because of the security, because of the complexity and because of the security issues, it's actually a bit harder to design, not only efficient, but it's to design protocols that are actually secure. So I'll get into that a little bit later. Okay. So those are the objectives and the relation to BLS signatures. Now I want to talk a little bit about the design requirements for our threshold ECDSA protocol. And these design requirements basically follow the fundamental principles that underlie the trust assumptions and the communication assumptions of the internet computer itself. So in many regards, the design requirements are determined by the architecture and the trust and communication models of the internet computer. So first of all, let me talk about the communication model. This is the communication model of the internet computer. We assume asynchronous communication. So we make no timing assumptions whatsoever about how long it takes for messages to be delivered from one replica to another. However, we do assume that consensus is available as a subprotocol. We already use consensus already in the internet computer, and we're going to be using it to also initiate signing requests. So when a subnet decides, yes, let's sign this message on behalf of this canister, that's a decision that's made using the consensus protocol. And in fact, we can use that same protocol to build new protocols like the threshold ECDSA protocol that I'm going to describe. So that's the communication model. Asynchronous, but we have consensus as a subprotocol. Now, as for the trust model, kind of the trust model that runs throughout the internet computer that we'll adopt here is that less than a third of the replicas in a subnet can be either corrupt or crashed. So we're assuming that more than 2/3 of the replicas are available and behaving correctly. We also want to have this trust assumption even hold in a more strict sense, in the sense that we even want this to be the case if an adversary can slowly over time corrupt various replicas, obtain their secret keys, as long as we update, refresh keys, recycle nodes sufficiently often. It's enough that that at most, or that less than 1/3 of the replicas in a subnet during any short time period are corrupt or crashed. So this is the trust model that's already kind of built into the internet computer. So we're not changing anything there. In terms of security for our signing protocol, we're going to adopt the standard notion of security from the cryptographic community, which is like a super strong notion of security. We don't want an adversary to be able to forge any message at all, even if he's asked to, even under a so-called chosen message attack, where he can ask for arbitrary messages. As long as he doesn't ask to sign a particular message, he can't come up with a forged signature. One kind of subtle point that comes up in looking at a protocol like this is that we want to at least explicitly state here another security requirement is that when a canister makes a signing request, that the subnet only generates a single signature, a single ECDSA signature. And this is important, especially in the Bitcoin and Ethereum ecosystems, because they rely on a certain kind of non-malleability property where you can't like transform one signature into another signature. And we want to maintain that property, and we certainly then want to ensure that we don't allow the protocol to generate, maybe two independent signatures when really only one was asked for. And it turns out that realizing, I state that as a explicit requirement because actually achieving it does take a little bit of thought how to make sure that that doesn't create any problems. Okay, so that's security. Now, I'll state two properties here: robustness and efficiency. This term robustness, maybe there's a better word in the literature for this, but what I want to say is this: the requirement is this: after a canister makes a signing request, a signature must be produced in a timely fashion, and of course, it should be relatively efficient. But this timeliness is important. And this should even be the case even if some replicas in the network are currently crashed or even corrupt in some arbitrary way. As long as this assumption holds, the protocol should give us back a signature quickly. And I bring that up because there's actually a lot of protocols in the literature which don't meet this requirement at all. That even a single crashed server could cause you to not be able to get a signature until and that would remain the case until all servers were online. Another requirement is, that did not crash. There we go. Another requirement is that I'll call it disaster resilience. So importantly, our ability to sign should not be lost, even if, let's put it this way, all the nodes in a subnet spontaneously combust, right? So there's potentially a lot of money tied up in Bitcoins, and we're really, I don't want to say which one is more important than the other, right? We're certainly concerned about keys being leaked to an adversary. That's a very bad thing that would happen. But we're also, let's say, just as equally concerned about keys going down the drain and being lost forever. So that's an equally important point. We don't want either one of those things to occur. So that's another. So we want a way to be able to recover even if all the nodes in the subnet go down. Key maintenance is another property. Let me kind of describe what I kind of mean. So this gets into a little bit of like, these are requirements just about how we want to manage signing keys. So we want to, at least in principle, have one signing key per canister at least. And we want to allow individual canisters to have subkeys. And it's already a fairly well-established standard in the Bitcoin and Ethereum communities to do what's called BIP32 key derivation. And we could easily do other types of key derivation, but this is the one that, but to be as standards compliant as possible and to be able to integrate with the least amount of friction in the Bitcoin and Ethereum communities, we're going to do this. So we're going to have canisters, one key per canister, and then within a canister, each canister can virtually kind of manage several subkeys. Now, there's a cost I want to point out here, because this will come into the design decisions that I'll describe shortly. There's a cost associated with maintaining each of these independent signing keys. First of all, what are these costs? So signing keys need to be shared among all the replicas in a subnet, and they need to be periodically reshared, right? So if we implement any type of proactive security of the type I talked about earlier, where we want to have security against a mobile adversary, then we're going to reshare these keys every actually a few minutes, probably is the way this would fit into our architecture. And also, if there's any ever subnet configuration changes, we need to reshare the keys. So there's a actual cost in terms of computation time, bandwidth, etc., an ongoing cost for each key. Also, because we want to implement some type of disaster recovery, whatever that mechanism is, there's going to be some cost associated with it, and that will presumably be multiplied by the number of independent signing keys that we have. Okay. So there's a huge literature on distributed signing protocols in general, and on ECDSA signing pros in particular. One of the things that we started looking at very early on in this project was this nice paper that's a nice survey of like everything on ECDSA threshold signing up to November 2020, so it's fairly recent. This paper covers a lot of ground and really goes over all the most important protocols. You can see here, these are the ECDSA protocols specifically that are considered in that paper. And those of you who are familiar with this probably would recognize a few of the things. And all of these protocols on ECDSA are fairly new. I mean, published, just in the last couple of years, really. So there's been like a flurry of research on this with the interest in cryptocurrency, really spurning a lot of active research. And a lot of these are implementation works too, where they really are interested in performant protocols. And yet, despite all of this work, none of these protocols actually satisfy any of our design requirements. And the issue is this: each one of these protocols either assumes a synchronous network, or they're not robust in the sense that I defined above, in the sense that a single replica can prevent, a single crashed replica can prevent a signature generation. And if those of you familiar with the literature, this is called security with abort. That's the terminology they use, but that's what it means, is that a single crash can just prevent you from generating a signature. They require essentially that all replicas be up and running. Now, just to be on the fair side here, some of these papers look at different scenarios where maybe you have actually a majority of corrupt parties, possibly, right? So if you have a majority of corrupt parties, then it's a known fact that you can't avoid this kind of lack of robustness. But we're not in that scenario, because we are assuming a minority of corrupt parties, and there's no reason, at least in theory, that you can't then guarantee delivery of a signature. So that's what we do, even though making that practical is a bit challenging. Okay. So that's all the backgrounds. Now I'll go through the design decisions. So first of all, now I'll get into some of the details of what we're actually doing. So the first design decision is that we're going to utilize one or maybe a small number of so-called master signing keys. And each one of these master signing keys is going to be deployed on at least 2 subnets, possibly more. What does this give us? So first of all, say we have a single master key on a given subnet. We're going to derive all of the canister level keys using a variation of BIP32 key derivation. So there's just one master key, and even the canister level keys are going to be derived using BIP32. And then you can derive more under BIP32 from those if you want. So what does this bias? Well, it solves the key maintenance issue. Remember that there's a certain cost associated with every key, and now we're going to really reduce the number of keys to a bare minimum. So that makes efficient implementation of all the key maintenance stuff very easy to achieve. It also deals with the disaster recovery issue, at least in the short term. We may develop more sophisticated disaster recovery techniques in the future, but for the present, this is really enough for what we need to do, in the sense that, since we'll be having a master key deployed on several subnets, as long as there's enough diversity geographically, politically, physically, etc., among the nodes in those different subnets, even if one subnet is irrevocably lost, the key is still up and running on another subnet, and we'll have mechanisms in place to recover it that way. Now, we are, from a security point of view, this is a little bit daunting, right? Because we're going to have a single master key from which all the canister keys are derived, and we don't want, one canister behaving badly to be able to affect any other canister. We want, the canisters to be sandbox, essentially, right? So, but now there's this intermingling because all the canisters will be deriving from the same master key. So this requires a careful security analysis, which we have done. And so we're very confident that is taken care of. Also, though, since we are going to be using a single master key on several subnets, so the security is going to be only as good as the security of the weakest subnet. So we only are going to, put these master keys out on high security subnets with, again, a large amount of physical diversity, a very well distributed subnet. Okay, so that's design decision number 1. Number 2, we're going to use a new interactive asynchronous verifiable secret sharing protocol, AVSS. And maybe you're more familiar, if you're somewhat familiar with our tech, we have a DKG protocol, which is non-interactive. We're going to be using an interactive DKG protocol. Why? So first of all, we need to run several of these protocols, not just to set up the key and not even just for resharing of the key, but actually each and every signing request is essentially going to need a small handful of these DKGs to be run. So it really has to be efficient. By making the DKGs interactive, we actually greatly reduced the inefficiency. It's much more efficient. We reduced the computational and bandwidth costs. It's the order of magnitude or better than the NIDKG. Now, NIDKG as well as this interactive DKG certainly requires consensus. Our protocols for DKG now are interactive, so maybe because they're interactive, they have a little bit more latency than the non-interactive DKG. But any latency is mostly going to be hidden by pre-computation, which I'm going to talk about below. This interactive DKG protocol only supports so-called low threshold, so F+1. If F is the number of corrupt parties or a bound, right, then the reconstruction threshold will be F+1. But this is good enough for what we want to do. High threshold signatures are kind of a niche thing that you don't really need. With the security assumptions in the model that we're making, it's perfectly okay. And all of these protocols here are approved, secure, under standard assumptions. In fact, the protocols themselves, as I kind of joke with my teammates, the protocols themselves are pretty much 1990s technology. We're kind of putting them together in what I think is a clever way, but it's pretty reliable, trusted technology. The last kind of design decision I'll walk you through here, and then I'm almost done, is that we're going to, for efficiency reasons, and also to keep the protocols simple, and simple is good for many, many reasons, which I don't have to tell you guys, tell you developers. Keeping it simple is always good, and so we're going to do a number of aggressive optimizations through pre-computation. And to a large degree, also these pre-computation ideas have also been around for a while. So they're not that new, although we have some new ideas there. So basically, as I already mentioned, we need several of these DKGs per signing request, a small handful, but we can actually pre-compute them because these DKGs are actually independent of the message that you're going to sign. So you can actually just pre-compute them and build up a little cache of them. So you always have like a few extras so that whenever a signing request comes in, then it's really simple, right? As long as you have some spare DKGs hanging around, then when a signing request comes in, it's basically as simple and efficient as BLS. Each replica will take, the replicas will take a collection of DKGs if they've already stashed. Then each replica will just release a single signature share, so a single message, a single artifact will be sent out, and each replica will collect these and combine them. It combines these to form a signature. So really kind of the same communication pattern as in ordinary BLS, which is nice. So we have all these optimizations. So to achieve that, we have a number of aggressive optimizations to get us to this point. And we proved, we did a really detailed and rigorous analysis of these optimizations. And in fact, it was a little bit tricky to get right. We in fact avoid some security weaknesses that other proposed schemes with similar optimizations are open to. But because of our analysis, we have a super high degree of confidence that, you know, our approach is basically, you know, provably secure. So to get to that high level of security, we actually came up with a few new ideas in the protocol design. So there are some new ideas here actually. That all of this stuff will be coming out in a paper or a couple of papers that will be publishing soon. Certainly they'll probably be on the ePrint archive, hopefully in a matter of weeks. So people who are interested in these kinds of details can read about them. So I'll close then with just a brief report on the engineering status of this project. We've got our detailed designs are done. Those are internal documents within Dfinity. We'll hopefully be making all of those available very soon. We have APIs and initial code scaffolding is well underway. I'm in touch with the engineering teams who are involved in this, and what my understanding is that our crypto team has 3 to 3.5 engineers, more or less full-time devoted to this now. and our consensus team has 4 engineers. We'll need both people working in crypto and consensus because, well, there's a lot of, cryptography that needs to, cryptographic functions that need to be written, and then this is an interactive protocol, and it's going to actually build on our consensus layer. The timeline for all of this engineering work is, our best estimate right now is 3 to 4 months to have, let's call it a preview implementation, which would be an implementation that has all the basic functionality and passes a battery of correctness tests. After that, we envision an in-depth security review. That would be people like me and others kind of, going through every line of code to make sure that the code lines up with our detailed designs and specifications that we've, proved secure and everything. So we'd have to make sure the code lines up with that. Then that should just be, well under a month, hopefully, maybe just a couple of weeks. And then after that, this is all a part of a larger BTC ETH integration project. These 2 projects will be able to move forward fairly independently. We already have plans in place to kind of build and test each of them independently of the other, and then it's just a matter of kind of gluing them together at the end. But there'll still be some, of course, integration and testing work that needs to go into that. So I'm pretty much, that's the end of my prepared remarks. So I'll leave it open to questions.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Victor. So we do have quite a few questions that I want to get through. So earlier today, Thomas Locker did a community conversation on the direct integration of Bitcoin. And there were a few questions that were raised there that Thomas said that you would be a better person to answer. So I will repeat. I'll repeat those questions for you in this call, since I know there are some people who are attending this call who were also in the previous call. So first question, Victor. So say there's a canister that somebody wants to run for years. However, during that period, the canister runs out of cycles, no one notices or doesn't top it up. Could this canister get deleted and then the Bitcoin within become lost?
That's a good question. So I think with our current designs, you can kind of already see how this would work, because we have the canister signing key is actually derived from a master key, which is used by many canisters, right? So we would be, the whole design would kind of be predicated on this master key being maintained eventually in perpetuity, right? So that means all of the canister keys derived from it would as well.
Okay, thank you, Victor. And then next question. So assuming that these proposals pass around the integration of Bitcoin and Ethereum, that would mean that subnets would be able to hold and control actual Bitcoin and Ethereum. So it is of paramount importance to ensure that these tokens are neither lost, for example, because the subnet failed and could not be recovered, or stolen, for example, because sufficiently many node providers were colluding to extract the secret key material. So have you considered this sort of risk, and how would you contain the risk of this happening?
Right. I think so those are certainly very important concerns. And I think I addressed both of those in my talk, but just to circle back a little bit. So certainly for the issue of a key being kind of going down the drain and being lost forever, which is a very valid concern. That's also top of our mind as well, which is why we want to have these master keys then actually deployed on multiple subnets. And of course, there would have to be some policies in place to ensure that these subnets were sufficiently disjoint, that even if one subnet irrevocably crashes, that the key can still be recovered. The key actually still exists on another subnet, and through a recovery process, you could maybe reconstitute the crash subnet and reconstitute that key as well. So that we're fairly confident about. And then the other issue is, obviously security concerns about colluding node providers, obtaining a key. And for that, we're going to be relying on our assumption that less than 1/3 of the replicas, and also the node providers need to be that at most less than 1/3 of them can be corrupt. So that's our assumption. If that assumption is wrong, well, is a problem. But we're only going to be running these protocols on subnets which meet a high degree of security requirements. Basically, at least for this foreseeable future, I think it's safe to say that the security requirements for a subnet running ECDSA will have to be at least as high as those running NNS.
Okay, thank you, Victor. So next question. Is there a risk that a distributed ECDSA algorithm, that it's not possible to create securely? Basically, are you sure that this whole idea actually works theoretically?
If that I have a pretty high confidence in. I mean, first of all, it's a pretty well-established area of research. So there's like a lot of we're building on a lot of work that's already pretty well established. There's a lot of well-studied concepts related to distributed secure computation. We're using, pretty much 99% kind of established techniques for doing this. We're not really sticking our necks out too far when it comes to, bleeding edge, new, unanalyzed, unscrutinized techniques. So this stuff has been around for a couple of decades. We're kind of putting it together in an innovative way to get a good balance between performance and security. But overall, I mean, if anything goes wrong with this, it's not going to be because of the theory behind it. Let's put it that way.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Victor. Very reassuring. And next question. What are the drawbacks to this algorithm being interactive?
So this is referring to the NIDKG, the DKG algorithm being interactive. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the drawbacks, they're only really kind of ultimately, interactive versus non-interactive. The different trade-offs are, number one, for an interactive protocol, it's interactive, which means it's a bit more complicated, maybe, but not too much more complicated. So, but the upsides of the interactive protocol are that you end up getting a much more efficient protocol. It turns out that to do an NIDKG, you have to do a whole bunch of very expensive zero knowledge proofs of knowledge, and these are, even given Jens's best efforts to make these as efficient as possible, there's only like so far that technology takes you today. So because of the frequency at which we're going to be designing to get lower bandwidth and lower CPU cost, the interactive approach is going to give you that. The only kind of downside to the interactive approach is that it's much harder to get high threshold security, but we're not aiming for high threshold security. I mean, we're aiming for F+1 security, where F is the not security. That's the wrong way of putting it. Our reconstruction threshold is just one more than the failure threshold, which for our purposes is good enough. There are other scenarios where you do want a high threshold, but for a generic distributed signing service, there's no compelling reason to do so. And there is, I'll just say this, I mean, that our interactive protocol has that limitation. There's only been recently some very recent work in the literature on having high reconstruction thresholds for interactive DKG, but that's all. It's not very practical. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Cool. Thank you, Victor. So next question. what is your opinion of the security benefits of shuffling the node members of a subnet periodically? And by shuffling, I mean that nodes from one subnet would periodically become members of other subnets, hopefully driven by a random process. And the idea here is to prevent node operator collusion.
Yeah, this must be a planted question, because this is something that
It's actually not. It's actually not a planted question.
I've been having discussions with Dfinity team members on this topic since I joined, about what are the mechanisms by which we can do node rotation. And I don't know if, from a security point of view, for this, I'd really want to bring in people into the discussion who are more like hardened, grizzled security experts than cryptographers like me, to bring in all these kind of real world facets. But I mean, there's clearly security to be potentially gained by recycling nodes. Even an alternative, what the questioner asked, an alternative would be to simply turn off and turn on a node periodically, just to wipe its memory, wipe its secret, and wipe its memory, and start off with totally fresh public keys and secret keys, so that that would also give you a certain resilience, even if you don't move replicas around from one node provider to another. It seems like both of those approaches have their pros and cons, and I think I think we have plans. It's certainly a project that we're looking into how to automate to some degree. I mean, right now you can grow and shrink and change the membership of a subnet. I just don't believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, there's like automatic policies in place to automatically do any kind of shuffling of that type.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a very intriguing idea and warrants further discussion as well. Okay, Victor, next question. Who holds the private keys for the master key, and is there such a concept?
Who holds the private keys for the master keys? Well, nobody in principle holds the private keys for the master keys. The private keys are generated, the master keys are generated by this interactive DKG protocol in such a way that no one node, no one computer, no one node can possibly reconstruct it in any way, shape, or form. The only way it could be reconstructed is if more than a third of the node providers for a subnet were to collude with one another.
Okay. Thanks, Victor. Next question. How many replicas do you think are required to make a network secure? Is it 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or more? The question asker would love to know your intuition here.
I don't know if I'm the right person to ask this question to. Can I cheat and ask the chat board?
You can call a lifeline.
Can I call a lifeline? Like, what's the current size of our NNS? If I can ask such a naive question.
We do have Dfinity team members on the call. So, okay, so Satya said 34.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, like I said, the plan though is to otherwise people can correct me. The plan, as far as I understand it, and again, I'm just kind of in my ivory tower here designing protocols. The plan, I'm just giving myself some space here so in case I step in it. The plan, I think, is to make all of these signing subnets as robust and secure as the NNS itself. So if that number is currently 34, I believe that's what we'll roll out with.
Okay, thanks, Victor, and thank you, Satya and Manu. So next question. So if the master key can recreate the actual signing key, what would be the process to allow the right people to recreate a lost key without letting the wrong people do so? Would that require an NNS vote to regenerate a lost key?
Well, okay, so again, keys, whether if they're lost, or and then later, if a key is lost and then later reconstructed, a reconstructed key will also never exist in one place at one time, right? The protocol for reconstructing, so if a whole subnet goes down, and even then it would be very hard for us to actually lose the shares of the key. But say everything, literally went up in flames, and the node providers' computers, literally went up in smoke, then the idea is that we have the same master key distributed among the nodes on an independent subnet, and there's no reconstruction really to do. What can happen is through an NNS proposal, if we want to say, bring that subnet back to life that crashed and that canister back to life that crashed, the process would be, there certainly would be an NNS process to do that. And then what would happen is there would be a protocol which would allow the distributed sharing of the master key on the surviving subnet to interact with the new reconstituted subnet to recreate on this new reconstituted subnet another independent sharing of the same key, but it would all be done using protocols that would never require that the master signing key itself was ever reconstituted in a single place. That's the beauty of kind of distributed cryptography.
Okay, thank you, Victor. So the next question has an engineering bent to it. So if other people from the DFINITY team on this call or any other community developer wants to answer, you guys are open to do so. But I will present it to you first, Victor. So essentially, if a developer wanted to connect an internet computer canister externally when writing a mobile React Native app, I've heard it's currently hard to do so because of BLS. Do you see a way that this could be improved in the future?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe is the question asking, like, since we don't seem to currently have support for distributed signing protocols for anything other than BLS applications that that require a different signature scheme, we can't support right now, but maybe this will help it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we can. So if you are the asker of this question, if you could clarify your question in the chat, I can represent it to Victor. And in the meantime, we can move on to some of the other questions that we have teed up. So next question. ECDSA signatures are required for the integration of Bitcoin and Ethereum, but what about other networks such as Polkadot? Do they also use ECDSA signatures?
That's a great question, and I don't know. Polkadot for sure, I don't know. I think, yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. ECDSA is pretty widespread right now in the cryptocurrency community. I know that Ethereum and others have proposals in place to use BLS, but I'm not even sure like how that's going to roll out and whether that's to what degree that will really happen. So sorry, I don't have a better.
No, I think that's very, very valid. So next question, earlier in this presentation, you had said that BLS signatures are more secure than ECDSA signatures. Could you please elaborate on why?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I said those exact words, but if I did, I'd like to amend my testimony.
Definitely.
So I've done I've done too many expert witness depositions. So if you, BLS is, what you can say about BLS is that it has a stronger proof of security in the sense that the way cryptographers like to analyze crypto systems like signature schemes is like to say, if you can break the non-forgeability property of the signature scheme, that means you must know how to compute a discrete log or solve some or factor this number, right? So BLS has a nice property that you can prove under this type of security property for BLS. For ECDSA, it's a fact of life that we don't have a proof of security in that sense for ECDSA. The best proofs of security we have are in so-called idealized models of computation, where the group is kind of, where the elliptic curve is kind of treated as a black box, where all you can do is is kind of abstract group computations, and it assumes that there's no more clever attack than doing, group computations. That's kind of the status there. Now, but to say that BLS is more secure than ECDSA, that's a trickier, because one has a proof and the other doesn't mean that the first is more secure than the second, because, and this is an important point, BLS requires a pairing, and all curves that are pairing friendly are potentially vulnerable to attacks which have not yet been discovered, just because groups that are curves that are pairing friendly just have more structure to them than the curves that are used for ECDSA. So the answer to your question is yes and no, but that's the about as much as I can say about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Victor. So the next question is an interesting one. So Victor, do you see any potential unforeseen consequences with the integration of Bitcoin and Ethereum? Does it maybe open us up to additional vectors of attack for the core internet computer network?
Boy, yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, okay. So the way my lawyers always coached me to answer these kinds of questions was to say no, and then to ask you to follow up by what you mean by that question, but I won't do that. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have anything super intelligent to say about that, other than the fact that, obviously, and this is the same thing with, canisters holding ICP, right? And now we're going to be there's also a proposal, I think, going on now, right, about canisters holding ICP. Is that right? Or that's a work in progress.
Yeah. No, that's an ongoing vote. Yeah.
Right. And now we're talking about canisters holding Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? So I think all I can say that's semi-intelligent, but also just kind of a boring tautology, is the fact that, yes, we'll become a much more lucrative target, right, once we host these things. So the consequence will be that people will be much more motivated to try and break our security defenses, right? But otherwise, that's about all I can say.
Definitely. And if any of the Dfinity team members or any of the community have additional thoughts on the topic, would love to hear from you in the chat as well. So Victor, moving on to the next question. So for you personally, from either a cryptography perspective or otherwise, what are you most excited about in terms of this upcoming proposal for canisters to be able to integrate with Bitcoin and Ethereum via ECDSA signatures?
That's a nice softball question. Let me just answer it this way. I'm having the most fun I've had in years doing this. So this is like a really cool project. And this is like I said, the most fun I've had in years. Designing kind of cool new things that are going to be kind of deployed right away in an important real world system is like, what more can an ivory tower academic ask for?
No, that's super great to hear. So next question. What do you think will be the most challenging about the integration of Bitcoin and Ethereum via ECDSA signatures, either in terms of design or implementation?
Well, I think in terms of the low-level technology, I think we have pretty much struggled with, and I think resolved most of the hard technical questions about, disaster recovery, key maintenance issues. I think there are broader questions related to how this will all integrate with the whole protocol stack in terms of the signing and interaction with the Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains. I guess Thomas would have been the one to discuss those challenges better. I don't necessarily understand those challenges all that well. But I think just from the ECDSA protocol, the threshold ECDSA design point of view, I think just getting a protocol that we can efficiently implement, both in terms of engineering time and in terms of performance, mapping it onto our architecture as it already exists. Those are challenges that were interesting, but I think we've got some pretty solid designs right now that that do everything we need them to do.
Yeah, and Dieter from Dfinity chimed in the chat. So he said, regarding security for the Bitcoin integration, we do some sandboxing of code that handles untrusted input Bitcoin blocks with regards to, for example, parsing in order to mitigate attack vectors such as remote code execution attacks.
Yeah, so right, so those I know are issues that came up in some of the integration design teams, but I think I'll leave those folks to discuss that. I'm lucky in the sense that I'm looking at this more from the point of view of kind of low-level cryptographic protocols and don't have to worry about these more complicated things. Okay.
Great. Okay, so for the people tuning into this call, the next question is the last submitted question. So if you have any burning questions for Victor, definitely make sure to get them in the Q&A box. So the last question for now is, since this is a low threshold algo F+1, it requires large subnets for security. Why can't the threshold be increased to slightly less than 2/3 of the nodes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it could be, but then we would be forced to. So let me answer that in two parts. I'll answer like why we don't do that, and then I'll try to answer why I don't think it's necessary, why it wouldn't bias that much. So we could do that if we used a much more expensive non-interactive DKG. The protocols that do high threshold tend to be a lot more inefficient. So that's the main reason. Now, let me, if more than if more than a third of the, so let me go to the second part of my answer now, is like why I don't think it's necessary to have higher thresholds. The only thing that could go wrong is if, more than a third of the parties are corrupt. Now, we do already have like high threshold BLS signatures, but those high threshold BLS signatures are not there to deal with the situation where we have more than 1/3 of the corrupt parties. Everything in the internet computer, would basically unravel if you had more than a third, truly corrupt malicious parties. Like everything would go wrong. So losing this Bitcoin would be just a part of that. We do have high threshold, 2/3 signatures that we do use, but those are used for very specific purposes. Because if you have a high threshold signature, like 2/3, n, right? So let's just say we have 100 nodes in a network, and the threshold is 67 or 68, right? But we're only assuming that 33 are corrupt. So when you see a high threshold signature, what does that tell you? That tells you that 68 minus 33, so that means 35 honest nodes must have agreed to sign this message. The other, right? That's what that means. It means so it means that a lot of nodes wanted to sign this message. A lot of honest nodes, not just one honest node. And for some applications you want that, but that doesn't really, it's not a requirement here. I mean, because remember, all of our signing requests are anyway going through consensus. So if more than a third of the parties are corrupt, then basically consensus is broken, and somebody can anyway ask for pretty much any message of any Bitcoin transaction that they want to be signed. But since we're going through consensus, we're assuming that all the honest parties agree to signing this message. So knowing that just one honest party agreed to sign this message is enough, which is why we can get by with the low threshold.
Okay, thank you, Victor. We actually got a few more interesting questions in the chat. Okay, so what is the most exciting thing in cryptography over the course of the next decade, in your opinion? Is it MPC? Is it fully homomorphic encryption, cryptographic obfuscation, something else? Basically, what's next after these DKG protocols that seem to be driving the space right now?
I see. So I'm supposed to have a vision. Wasn't it George W. Bush who was not who was not the vision guy? I forget. So I'm not sure if I'm never like the best at giving these vision kind of answers. So I certainly, you mentioned You mentioned fully homomorphic encryption. That's a space I was working like a lot in the last 10 years. So I don't know if that's really, what's going to happen in that space in the next 10 years, if somebody can come up with some even still more efficient implementations of FHE, that would certainly help. I think at the moment, fully homomorphic encryption is still a little bit too sci-fi for real world applications. I think there's a lot of in MPC. There's been like a flurry of work in more efficient MPC in the last few years, and I think there's going to be a lot of pressure in that space because of all the DeFi and blockchain. There's been a lot of stuff going on just the last few years. I think that I think in the multi-party computation space, there's going to be a lot of interesting work happening there in the next few years, I would say. Other than that, a big space where still the jury is out as to what's going to happen next is in the post-quantum space, right? There's still a lot of issues there in terms of what we'll do in general as a cryptographic community. What are the best solutions to that? So it's still like a very new area, and there's certainly areas. There's certainly cryptography based on lattices that people are looking at, but there's other algebraic types of stuff that people are looking at. So that's like a pretty big area. Whether we'll need ever post-quantum, whether quantum attacks really become a thing is also a big. I must have a vision. Yeah, I have visions, but I'm not very good at describing them. So.
Another question related to that. I think you might have touched upon that very briefly in your answer just now, but most of the time, developers don't have to think about encryption, it just works. But even though it's invisible, encryption is an integral part of our technological infrastructure. And some people are saying with the advent of quantum computers, today's security schemes will soon become obsolete. So what sort of implications does that have for the internet computer overall?
For the internet computer overall, I mean, that's we've been talking about that, and there have been lots of ongoing discussions about that. It seems that, and others can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the current state of that issue is that there aren't any good, efficient threshold signature schemes that are post-quantum secure. I think that's the issue. So we can do everything else: encryption, regular signatures, even MPC to a certain degree. But if I'm not mistaken, threshold signatures are still kind of a challenge, and maybe we'll figure out how to do that soon. But that's probably our biggest challenge for the internet computer, since we do kind of rely on that.
Completely. And it is I know a lot of it is also still unknown in terms of like the timelines of quantum computing and so on and so forth, but definitely something very interesting to think about and consider as it pertains to the internet computer. So we are at time. So Victor, thank you so much for your presentation. And thank you so much for the community members for tuning in, and make sure to vote on this proposal starting next Monday at the NNSDAP. Thank you all again, and see you at a future community conversation. Bye, everyone.